Hi, this is ego-utilitarianism. In this video, I'm going to attempt to resolve the logical inconsistencies of modern theories of value, which include the subjective, the labor, and the objective or intrinsic theories of value. Now, I just want to warn people: the mathematics I refer to for this theory it, are not meant to confuse the viewer. It's meant to clarify using the most logically rigorous discipline. Using examples from anything else, just since the foundation isn't so sound, is not good for long-term understanding, right? Since I can refer to a mathematical idea, which you can Google, Wikipedia, and these have been very carefully thought out by mathematicians. And there's no other discipline in math that has a grasp of logic than mathematicians. So while some of these concepts are somewhat abstract, I made careful choice into choosing them so that they're not beyond like someone that's very strong in high school algebra, right? We've all probably somewhat come across similar concepts when studying algebra, or just from entering numbers in your calculator, right? I'm going to be talking about things like undefined and things, and I'm sure we've all been introduced to that idea in algebra. Okay, so the relative theory of value states that all value is both relative and objective. I'm still trying to prove if if relative is objective, right? These are two sets, and I'm thinking if I'm still trying to prove if these two are the same. Anyways, this includes the value of a good to a consumer, which is what usually all these modern value theories are referring to. They're not referring to, height, weight, something that another person would think is, in their definition, objective, right? Or like, yeah, intrinsic value, or the properties of a value, properties of an object. Um, but what they don't realize is that the value of a good to a consumer is actually well, I'll get into it later. Anyways, let me go through some critical definitions that I may be using um, throughout this presentation. And so this is my personal definition set. This is a definition set that I chose. I I created. I may have used some references to the dictionary or other sources, but I've built upon it so that everything should be logically consistent. If anyone here watching the video can see any logical inconsistencies, please let me know in the comments below or send me a message. Or yeah, if you want to chat about this, just send me a message. Okay, so the most important, there's reality, right? The universe, realities are all synonyms. There's nothing outside of it. Imagination is not outside of it. Nothing. That's my perspective, and it makes sense that way. There's no magical realm. There's no multiverse. If in physics they say, there's quote unquote multiverses. I just considering all part of one reality, right? So there's only one universe. You can call it dimensions. I don't know. That's probably beyond the scope of my understanding. But anyways, there's a universe, reality, and anything in it. And reality is composed of objects, right? Um, Now here's the trick thing. So this is the basic element of reality, an object, right? Anything existing in reality, anything the mind can attempt to comprehend, a potential object of thought, but one whose existence is not necessarily dependent on thought. So you see here, I tried to make careful. I tried to take care into showing that it's objects. At least the vast majority of objects are not dependent on a mind, not necessarily dependent on mind. I have a specific subcategory of objects that do depend on the mind entirely, and that's what I call subjective here. But let's keep going. So objective being an object, that means any object is objective by default. Everything is objective, right? You see it in the word here, object. You see the root word object in there with the suffix "if." So, being an object should be. So these are logically equivalent essentially. If something's objective, it's an object. If something's an object, it's objective. Okay, so subjective. An object, so again, this is a subset of objectives or a subset of objects. So I subcategorize objects into subjective and non-subjective. That's a valid partition, right? Any partition is valid in the sense that any subset and its complement partition the superset. And this is the superset of all supersets, right? The universe. So anyways, subjective. An object in a mind that is objectively determined. I know you have to suspend what you normally would call objective in this case, right? And just say, when I say objectively, it's an object, right? As soon as a mind creates it, it becomes an object. That makes it objective. So it's logically consistent here. So again, when I say objective, you have to refer to my definition and not anyone else's. And you got to try, some people have trouble letting that go, but what can you do? So an object in a mind that is objectively determined, assigned a value. So when I say determined, I mean it in a mathematical sense. Right? Determined means it's assigned a value. Like I don't want to have to use the old definition of objective, but objectively assigned a value. Right? There's a value there that your mind didn't create. Right? So anyways, so an object in the mind that is objectively determined, mathematically assigned a value, right? By a mind, completely by the mind, right? So let me get this out. So an object in the mind that is objectively determined, assigned a value completely by the mind. Oops, I'm sorry. I misspoke. I must have misread that. So an object whose value that is assigned completely by the mind, arbitrary and when I say arbitrary, so a synonym for subjective is arbitrary. And by arbitrary, I mean in the mathematical sense, right? You can on the dictionary.com, you look up arbitrary and you'll see the mathematical definition. I think it's definition 5, where it's not assigned a value. So when something's not assigned a value arbitrarily in mathematics, that leaves freedom for you to assign a value, right? So it leaves room for the mind to assign a value. Okay, so non-subjective. And in mathematics, there's concepts called degrees of freedom. I don't want to talk about determinism, but there's some freedom for the mind there to assign a value. And in order for it to be subjective, it has to be completely arbitrary. It has to be completely determined by the mind. No other influences but the mind itself. Okay. Non-subjective, that's the complement of subjective. So yeah, I've subcategories, I've partitioned objects into two categories, subjective and non-subjective. And by non-subjective, I'm kind of referring to what people think of as objective, but I reserve that for a different meaning, right? So non-subjective is anything that's not subjective, right? So obviously, if something that completely determined by the mind, everything else must be either partially or completely not dependent on a mind or assigned a value by the mind, right? So an object that is partially determined by the mind or independent from any mind. That's what I mean by non-subjective. I rarely refer to this one. I might misspeak sometimes and I say objective when I actually meant this, just because it's so embedded in my head. So, okay, value in general. So in general, a value, and I'm not talking about the value when we talk about theories of value, okay? In general, the value, a value is a measurement of an object. Value is an object itself, right? I can, let's, just for a thought exercise, let's look at the term object. Anything existing in reality, anything that the mind can attempt to comprehend, I can attempt to ascertain a value, any value, and that's what makes it an object and an objective by default, right? So you see how just my definition set works. You have to always refer to my definition set. I might misspeak, but correct me or whatever. But um, you have to rely on this definition set and no one else's, right? Because uh, you'll find yourself leading to some contradiction that isn't there if you conflate my definition set and another's definition set. Okay, so let's explore the term relative. So now that we've defined other critical terms, now there's a very special term in my theory, right? Relative. Um, let's kind of explore what I mean by relative. So relative to what? In common language, relative and comparative are kind of synonymous, right? Um, you're big compared to that guy, or you're small compared to that guy. You're heavy compared to you're fat compared to you're beautiful compared to that guy, or that thing is bigger than that thing, right? So it's usually in reference to a specific unit of measurement, right? We measure things by comparing it. If you notice, all your units of comparison or units of measurement is the same type of object you're trying to measure, right? So when you're measuring length, you can give it in centimeters, meters, feet. That part's arbitrary, but these are all units of length, and you're just comparing to. So you can also you can do it implicitly, like saying, oh, the length of that is 5 football stadiums, right? But we know each football stadium is, let's say, 200 yards. So by transitivity, it's if it's two football stadiums, it's 400 yards. So it's something like that. It's ultimately quantitative, right? There's a quantitative portion and then a unit of measurement. So it's kind of like a multiplication there, right? 2 football stadiums. That's essentially implying 2 times 200 yards, which is 400 yards. So all units of measurement are an actual. It's the same type of object you're trying to measure, right? If you're measuring length, you're gonna have to compare it to a unit of length, and so on and so forth, right? Anyways, so if f, and by f I'm referring to a function, f of x. If a function were some type of value function, right? So imagine some type of value function, where when you're trying to evaluate value, your mind's going through it. It's almost like as easy as evaluating an algebraic expression, right? 2 plus 1, right? You're trying, and when you evaluate that, you're going to get 3, right? According to the properties of addition. So f of x, when you're trying to value something, you can necessarily restrict it to this, right? A function that a multivariable function, right? So in order to evaluate something, you really need 2 things: the object you're trying to measure, x, and I need the unit of measurement you want, right? So when someone asks the length of something, I'm still at that point. You in my mind, I'm doing this f of x. You've given me the object x, and I'm putting it into the length function, and I'm trying to determine a value. The problem is it leaves room for freedom for me to interpret, right? I can give it in feet, yards, centimeters, nanometers, or what have you. But by doing this, if your question is more defined and impose more restrictions on the answer, someone could ask me, what is your height in feet? And by doing that, by giving me the unit of measurement here, by adding another variable to this function, he's restricted me into one unique numerical answer, right? If he didn't restrict that, I can give several. I can say 5 feet, or what is that, 60 inches. They're equivalent, and I can choose either one and still have a valid answer. Now, when you restrict me by giving the units you want, it restricts me to, and the answer becomes merely numerical, right? And in this case, when you just ask what's the size, or what's your height, you've given me the freedom to choose the units. Therefore, it doesn't restrict it to a unique numerical part. Remember, I can choose 5 or 60 as long as I as long as I attach it to a unit. They're both valid, right? 5 feet, 60 inches. Okay, so when people, so I'm going to talk about this later. I'm talking about poorly defined statements or queries, questions. people ask for things, they don't even know what they're asking for, or at least he hasn't given enough information for the person to actually determine an answer to give the person making the query, presenting the question. So value can be evaluated, and by evaluated I mean an attempt at comprehension from any perspective. That doesn't mean, again, does not necessarily mean you'll ever actually know the objective value or understand, make a true comprehension. You'll ever comprehend it fully, right? You can comprehend it partially, not at all, but just as long as an attempt is made, right? That's an evaluation by the subject, or by subject I mean person, from any perspective. So value can be evaluated from any perspective. It is objective. That's what makes it objective. It's an object of apprehension. Remember, you can attempt at comprehension. You can, if you look at the back of anything that can be the mind can attempt to comprehend, right? So this qualifies it as that. Okay, so values is an object, and it can be it's an object, therefore it's objective, right? So since it's an object, it's objective. That means you can attempt to comprehend it. It doesn't need a mind to exist necessarily. Value, unless it's subjective value, right? But non-subjective value, there is a subcategory of non-subjective value that does not depend on any mind, or in the least only partially determined by mind. When I say partially, I haven't really explored that. I'm wondering what that is. Like I've been thinking about ideas like action, right? Action is restricted by nature, right? You have a limited amount of choices in action, but it's semi-determined by the mind. So your options are restricted by the laws of physics, but your mind can still select from those viable options. And that's what I mean by partial. Now, I really haven't explored this idea. It's an interesting train of thought, but let's just put that aside for now. So velocity is relative, right? And by relative I mean comparative. So I haven't defined my version of relative, but in the normal sense, there's an alternate definition of relative in the dictionary that says it's comparative. Like velocity, you can't talk about velocity without a reference point. Anytime you say you're going 50 miles an hour, like in your car, or you're looking at your speedometer and it says 50 miles an hour, the reference point is the Earth, the surface of the Earth, right? So you're going 50 miles per hour relative to a fixed point on the surface of the Earth. And that's what's always implied there, but it's never said, right? So that's what I hate about language. There's just so many implicit things out there. Even in math, something as rigorous as math, you look at an algebraic expression like x squared plus 2. There's an implicit 1 coefficient in front of the x squared term, right? So there's implied things that people kind of lose sight of. They take it for granted because they're not shown it explicitly. And that's the thing. So velocity is relative, right? You can never talk about velocity without another reference point. You need two objects in order to calculate velocity. That's in other words what I'm trying to say. And this is relevant in terms of value, because it's the same with value. Okay, and I'm going to get into that a little later. So okay, so here's dictionary definition relative, right? Person, so no. Something dependent upon external conditions for a specific nature. Something having. I'm gonna actually, my definition of relative is actually somewhat a combination of these two. But let's get into it. So forget the dictionary definition. I just wanted to talk about how it's used connotatively. Definition 2. Okay, so we've kind of explored what the connotative definition of relative, how many different meanings. Let me talk about something counterintuitive. In physics, they have a subject called relativity. Einstein, E equals mc squared. So in relativity, it's very counterintuitive, right? So I've taken engineering physics. And the latter part is concentrating toward quantum mechanics and relativity. So I only know it on that level. I'm not a physicist, but I slept that Holiday Inn. But anyways, it's very counterintuitive, right? At first, you have to know it only mechanically. I was, admittedly, I still don't. It's still so counterintuitive that it's hard for the mind to comprehend, because same thing what happened with Molyneux. Your mind has already understood something to be this, and in reality it's something else. And when your mind fixates on something, a concept, it's hard to let go. But better people can do it easier. But it's so, I can see why, everybody kind of they rejected Einstein, probably at first. I think so. I forgot my physics history or whatever. But anyways, let's explore some of the ideas that are very counterintuitive in relativity. So in physics, right, there's something called Lorentz contraction, or length contraction. So when we what I'm going to get into a more intuitive, well, something that's more known to the rest of society: time dilation. This is somewhat related to that. By related, I don't mean relative, but okay. So in length contraction, length. So I know I used that in examples before in the definitions, but length is actually dependent. It's not absolute, meaning that it's the same, right? When I ask a question of length, I need another variable to know in order to give an answer. That's perspective, right? Not a mind's perspective, but the conditions of the observer. These are two different things, right? So the thing is, in Lorentz contraction, or length contraction, the length of an object is not the same for everybody depending on the conditions of observation. So in other words, just to put it simply, it contracts, right? Someone could see a length of an object. So we could both arrive at this. So not only does length depend on the units of measurement, right? So when I ask for a length, I can try to restrict you, but it's not enough. I can ask for a length of an object and and ask the units of measurements I want it in, but it's not enough, right? You need one more variable, and it's also a function of other things, but you need perspective, right? You need the velocity and direction of the perspective you're measuring it at. How do I pause this?